Okay, in his work Proslogion, Anselm of Canterbury came with the idea which is known to us as the Ontological Argument. In this argument, God's existence is not just possible or probable or very likely, but it is actually logically ensured. Anselm defined God as that than which nothing greater can be thought of. Anselm said that this being must exist in the mind, even in the mind of the person who denies the existence of God, aka an atheist. He proposed that if the greatest possible being exists in the mind, it must also exist in reality. Why, you ask? Well, because if it only exists in the mind, then an even greater being must be possible to think of, one which exists both in the mind and in reality. And therefore, this greatest possible being must exist in reality. Well, by now you have seen that I've got some spectators as well. These are my friends from the village, and they're very curious. Whenever they see a camera, they come running towards me and they want to see what's going on. Anyway, let's go to it. Good, my apologies for the introduction. I was a little bit out of breath because it's steaming hot outside. I'm now sitting in my usual office, the community church building, which is a little bit cooler, although it's still really, really warm. Anyway, ontological. The word ontological comes from ontology. And I know ontology sounds very smart, but its meaning is actually pretty simple. Ontology is the study of the nature of being or existing. So the ontological argument simply means a logical argument that, if true, argues in favor of the existence of God. It relies on nothing else than good old logic to show that if the premises are true, God must exist. Actually, Anselm formulated two versions of the ontological argument, and this was only just discovered in the 1960s by Malcolm and Hartshorne. Groothuis says that Anselm was puzzled over the unbelief of the fool. You know, the Bible verse which says only the fool says in his heart there is no God. So he is puzzled about this unbelief, and he labors to construct an argument to defeat this fool and thereby actually defeating atheism. So let's just dive into his first argument, and we will talk about it a little bit more later on, right? So the ontological argument goes as follows. Premise number 1. God is understood or defined as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And even the fool possesses this concept of God. Premise number 2. A thing exists either in A, the understanding only, such as the idea of a painting before it is painted, or B, in both the understanding and in reality, such as the existing in the mind of the painter and then existing on the canvas. Premise number 3. It is greater to exist in reality than to exist merely in the understanding. Premise number 4. If God exists merely in the understanding, existing only in the mind of the fool, then God is not the greatest possible being, since a being that existed in reality would be greater than a being that existed only in the understanding. Premise number 5. But God is by definition the greatest possible being. We just read that in premise number 1. And then premise number 6. Therefore, God exists not merely in the understanding, as the fool claims, but in reality as well, by reductio ad absurdum, which means that this conclusion is the only right one because all the other conclusions are reduced to absurdity. Other conclusions contradict the first premise. Okay, now, one of the arguments given by critics comes from Kant. Kant basically said that this argument leans on the term existence. And Yeah, rightly so. He said that Anselm made existence into an attribute or quality of God, just like we say that God is love. Love is the attribute. But existence, so the critics say, cannot be an attribute. However, try to imagine reading a fairy tale to a child. I've done that quite often. The child may ask whether the animals in the story exist or not. And you would say, well, the horses, they exist in reality, but the flying elephant doesn't. You see, in this case, the child asked actually a legitimate question, right? The child makes existence into an attribute of the animal. Okay. Others would say that an imaginary God would do just fine. That's enough. They say an imaginary God would do just fine. But when they say this, they totally miss the point of that what is great. Once my wife and I had 4 children, and we really wanted a 5th one. What a great thought, right? But we had to wait 5 years before God gave us our 5th child. And I can assure you, having the boy in reality is even greater than just in my understanding or in my thoughts. A God that only exists in the people's mind isn't the greatest thing that one can imagine. The greatest possible God we think of has to exist. If he only exists in our minds, a simple tool like a hammer or a sickle is greater because it actually exists in reality. And this is what we call reductio ad absurdum, reduction of absurdity. Anyway, as I said, the original argument is a little bit daunting. At least it is for me, and many philosophers who are way better trained in this field than I am think the same. So I think that Alvin Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga's variant on the argument is a bit easier to understand. His argument is what we call the Modal Ontological Argument. Plantinga uses modal logic, which is a method of forming arguments based on 3 types of objects. The first object is impossible objects. Impossible objects are objects that cannot exist rationally, like a square circle or a married bachelor. The second object is a contingent object. Contingent objects are objects that depend on something else for their existence, like apples depends on an apple tree or eggs depend on chickens. In reality, all space-time objects are contingent. They depend on physics to exist, if nothing else. And then the third one is the necessary object. Necessary objects are objects that depend on nothing for their existence. And number 3 might be, for example, the number 3, we were talking about number 3 here, the number 3 might be a necessary object, for example. It doesn't depend on anything else. Okay, and in addition to these 3 types of objects, we also need to add another modal logic concept to our repertoire. The idea of possible worlds. A possible world is not another planet or a parallel dimension. No, in logical arguments, possible worlds are simply descriptions of the way reality could have been or could be. You could imagine, for example, a world in which the Great War, the Second World War, was lost by the Allies and the Nazis would rule the world. That is a possible world. Or imagine a world in which no poverty existed. These are both possible worlds. But a possible world cannot be, and here it goes, a possible world cannot be an impossible world. There cannot be a universe in which there are 4-sided triangles. These things are logically absurd and cannot exist in any possible world. Okay, are you still with me? Else try to read it again on my website. I'll put a link to this transcript in the description of the video below. Okay, and finally, before we look at Plantinga's argument, we also need to define what we mean by God. You see, Anselm saw God as what he called a maximally great being. He said that God would always be the greatest being that anyone could imagine. In other words, if someone could imagine a greater being, then that being would be God. Anselm also said that God would only have properties that would make him great. There are no properties in him that make him less. Let me give you a few examples. You see, a maximally great being is timeless instead of limited to time. Or God should be all-powerful and not lacking some power. He should be all-knowing and he should not knowing some things. He should also be eternally living instead of mortal. In other words, a maximally great being should be all good and not sometimes good. Okay, let's go to Plantinga's Modal Ontological Argument. Here we go. Premise number 1. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. Premise number 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Premise number 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being exists in every possible world. Premise number 4. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world. Premise number 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Premise number 6, conclusion, therefore a maximally great being exists. Now, the fun thing about this argument is the fact that among most philosophers, premise number 2, 3, 4 and 5 are impossible to deny or disprove. They recognize that they just simply follow from premise number 1. In fact, most professional philosophers only debate the first premise. So, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. That's the only one they would debate. So how does this work? For many, the conclusion might be a little bit abrupt. When I heard this argument the first time, I right away started to look for the catch. It can't be right. So how exactly does this work? Well, you see, the first premise makes a truth statement. And this statement can be accepted or rejected. It says that it is possible that a maximally great being exists. And most atheists readily accept that it is possible that God exists. The thing is that they just don't believe that God does exist. Then we go to premise number 2, and this premise just repeats the first premise by using possible worlds, which is an easier way of looking at the argument, because anything that is possible in some possible world by definition. Oh, wow. Then premise number 3 puts forward that if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, he exists in every possible world. Why? Because he is maximally great. And if he only existed in one possible world, he is just a little great. But when he exists in 2 possible worlds, he's better than the one who was only possible in one possible world, you know. But now we're talking about a maximally great being, and as such, he must exist in all possible worlds. Then premise 4 begins to wrap things up. Because if a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world we live in. Our world is not a possible world, but it is the actual world. Premise number 5 simply follows the logic that if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximal great being exists. So, and then return to the first premise, this is the conclusion. It is not just possible that God exists, but it is logically necessary. And so we can say that God exists. So how about that? Now just think of the possibilities. When someone accepts that it is possible that God exists, he or she just entered an inescapable deductive reasoning, a foolproof logical case that inevitably leads to the fact that God does exist. Because of the ontological argument, atheistic and other unbelieving philosophers find themselves in a pickle. If they want to hold on to their worldview, they have to insist that it is impossible that God exists. But be that as it may, if they want to keep their position and being intellectually honest at the same time, they must demonstrate in what way the very concept of God is illogical, or in other words, how can God be impossible? How can he be impossible? So the atheist must debate in modal logical terms that God is not only not necessary, but is also an impossible object. The fun thing is that when they cannot prove that God is impossible, we can start where we have left. We can pick up where we have left and show through the ontological argument that failing to prove that God is impossible is the same as logical evidence that God exists. Okay. Throughout almost 1,000 years, many attempts have been made to debunk this ontological argument. Many atheists on the internet tried as well, and some actually believe they did. You see, that's because many of them are way smarter than all the philosophers combined throughout the ages. Anyway, there are some sophisticated rebuttals out there, but I'm not going to tackle them. Except one. That's the one with the unicorn. Because I'm not so fond of unicorns, I will call it a dragon instead. But I mean, this is just a funny rebuttal, and I just wanted to mention it. So, how is the maximally great unicorn work? Well, I don't use unicorn. I'm going to use dragon because I love dragons. Okay, premise number 1. It is possible that a maximally great dragon exists. Premise number 2. If it is possible that a maximally great dragon exists, then a maximally great dragon exists in some possible world. Number 3. If a maximally great dragon exists in some possible world, then a maximally great dragon exists in every possible world. Number 4. If a maximally great dragon exists in every possible world, then a maximally great dragon exists in the actual world. Number 5. If a maximally great dragon exists in the actual world, then a maximally great dragon exists. Number 6. Therefore, a maximally great dragon exists. And there you go. Debunked. Or not? Well, let's look at it. No. It's not debunked. Why not, you ask? Well, you see, the dragon is a physical object and as such a contingent and not necessary object. This is a problem because there might be a possible world in which space and time never started to exist or quickly collapsed into singularity. You see, and a dragon, because it is physical, simply cannot live or exist in such a possible world. Also, being a maximally great physical being, the dragon is not logical because to be maximally great means that it should be able to live without the limitations of a physical existence. Now the critic starts to be a little bit cynical and says, oh no, these objects might be valid for dogs or cats, but their dragon is mythical. Just like God, they claim to have a maximally great mythical being. Well, the mythology of a dragon says that it is a huge physical fire-breathing lizard with wings and maybe some horns, I don't know, scaly lizard. When the critics say that he believes this mythology to be true, would be the same as confirming that these dragons really exist. Enormous, fire-breathing, flying dragons are physical objects that exist in time and space. Therefore, a dragon can never be seen as a necessary object. But the critic, who by now starts to look like a dragon himself, says, this is a very special dragon. My dragon is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, etc. Too bad. Now the critic just cut his own fingers. By stripping the dragon from his own unique properties and then giving it the properties of God shows that the critic just admitted that God exists. The biggest difference now is that You and I call God our Father in heaven, and the critic has just given him a different name, namely dragon. Anyway, there is much more to say about this argument and all the objections, but this will have to do for now. I hope I have made this argument a little bit more clear. Agreed. It is not the first argument I would use when I encounter an unbeliever at my mother's tea party, for example, especially because the depth of the ontological argument may make it hard to access for many. But still, it is a nice arrow to have in your apologetic quiver. Of course, there are those who may think they can ridicule this argument, but by doing so they only demonstrate a poor philosophical insight, which is actually pitiful because mostly these people think very highly of themselves. You know, the sort of thinking like everybody in the whole world is wrong except he or she. Yeah, another thing about this argument is the fact that it is a so-called a priori argument, which means that it isn't depending on any other experiments or arguments. And as such, it doesn't directly clarify how this maximally great being revealed himself in history. That is true, but if God is perfect, then we know for sure that he cares about his creation because he is perfect. And he will reach out to his creation in one way or another. Also, for example, the idea of the Trinity is supported by the ontological argument, because a perfect and all-loving being needs to have something to love outside his own creation. And the Trinity is also guaranteed to us in the Bible. So we have a very strong rational indication to believe the stories in the Bible about God who came to live among us in the person of Jesus Christ because he wanted to save us. And so the circle is complete. You start with a daunting philosophical argument and you end up with a bulletproof rational reasoning that the Bible actually tells you the truth. Don't you just love it? I really like this. Anyway, I would also ask you to I also would like to point to the description of this video. You'll find a lot of information there. Whenever I find or use some interesting things, books or links, I'll link it in there. But you can also find ways to support me. And you know, some of you already did, and some of you are doing it on a regular basis. And I want to say a big thanks to you guys and maybe girls, I don't know. I would also like to invite you to my Odyssey channel. Odyssey is a platform which is based on a new protocol called Library. And it is censorship free, unlike YouTube or others. It would be great if you start following me there. I'm mostly active on that channel. You may comment on my videos on BitChute or on YouTube, but you most likely won't receive a reply. Sometimes I am able to open those channels, but more often not actually. So please comment, come to my Odyssey channel and comment there, and I try to respond every time. You can also start your own channel on Odyssey, and if you use my invitation in the description, we will both receive some free LDC, which is nice. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching. God bless you, and we see each other in the next video. Thank you for watching this video. You can give me a thumbs up if you liked it. You can also subscribe to my channel, or even better, follow me on Odyssey. That way you will never miss a new video. You will find all the links in the description below.